The early morning sun slowly rose over the wide Texas panhandle, painting the open land in gold and red. The wind moved across the tall grass, carrying dust, heat, and the quiet promise of danger. It was the kind of day that looked peaceful from far away, but anyone living on the frontier knew better. On this land, peace could turn into chaos in a single heartbeat. In the middle of this silent, empty world stood a small settlement called Adobe Walls. It was nothing more than a few simple buildings, trading posts, bunkhouses, and a blacksmith shop used by buffalo hunters. It was a rough place filled with hard men who lived by their rifles. Among them stood a quiet, thin man with sharp eyes and calm hands. His name was Billy Dixon. No one who looked at him would guess he was about to create one of the greatest stories ever told about the American frontier. As dawn approached, the hunters were still asleep. Some had stayed up most of the night playing cards, sharpening weapons, or repairing their gear. Others were too exhausted to care. They hunted buffalo all day, every day. A sunrise meant another long, hot, bloody day of work. But on this morning, they woke to something else. A loud crack slammed against the roof of one of the buildings. Then another, and another. At first, the hunters thought the thick adobe walls were shifting. Maybe the old building was settling. That happened sometimes. But the noise kept coming. Heavy thuds. The sound of something striking the wood beams with force. One of the men rushed outside, still pulling on his boots. His eyes went wide. He shouted a single word, "Indians." And suddenly the quiet morning exploded with fear. From the ridges surrounding Adobe Walls, warriors of the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes charged forward, riding fast, shouting battle cries that filled the air. The ground began to shake beneath hundreds of pounding hooves. The hunters dropped everything and grabbed their rifles. They ran to the doorways and windows, firing at the attackers. Smoke rose from the guns. Horses screamed. Men yelled orders that mixed with the wind. It was chaos. Inside the settlement were only 28 men and 1 woman. Outside were several hundred highly skilled warriors. For the hunters, the situation was simple: fight or die. But even in all that chaos, Billy Dixon did not panic. He did not shout. He did not freeze. Instead, he watched the attack with the same cold, steady eyes he used when taking aim at a buffalo miles away. He had seen fear before. He knew how it grabbed the heart and squeezed, but he also knew how to push it aside. That was the only reason he was still alive in a world as harsh as this one. The battle raged for hours. Warriors rode close, fired arrows, and quickly pulled back. Hunters fired from the windows, sending clouds of dust into the air. The hot sun beat down on both sides. Sweat ran into eyes. Hands shook. Guns jammed. But no one stopped. Billy Dixon moved carefully from one shooting position to another, helping his fellow hunters reload, calling out distances, warning others when riders approached. He never wasted a bullet. Every shot mattered. By late morning, the attack slowed. The warriors pulled back from the settlement and gathered on a distant ridge. They looked small, like dark shapes against the bright sky. But they were not leaving. They were regrouping. The hunters knew this meant another wave of attacks was coming. Many were already wounded. Some rifles were running low on ammunition. Every man inside Adobe Walls felt the same sinking fear. Someone pointed to the ridge and said, "They're planning their next move." Another man turned to Billy Dixon. "Can you reach them from here?" Dixon looked at the ridge, squinted his eyes, and measured the distance in his mind. It was much farther than any hunter usually attempted. More than a mile. The wind was against them. The angle was terrible. The shot felt impossible. He shook his head. "No man can make that shot," he said quietly. But the hunters kept asking. If someone didn't break that group apart soon, the next attack might be the last. They needed something big, something that would make the warriors rethink continuing the fight. Dixon finally sighed and nodded. "Bring me the Sharp's rifle." It was a heavy, powerful buffalo gun, slow to load, but deadly at long range if the shooter knew exactly what he was doing. Billy lay down on the ground, placing his cheek gently against the cool metal of the rifle. He breathed slowly, letting the world grow quiet around him. His heart steadied, his hands relaxed. He looked through the sights, adjusting for distance, adjusting for wind, adjusting for luck, because a shot like this always required luck. The hunters watched silently. Their lives depended on this moment. Billy took one last breath. Then he pulled the trigger. The rifle roared like thunder. Smoke burst into the air. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. The bullet flew across open prairie, spinning through heat and wind, traveling farther than almost any bullet had in a real battle before. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, on the faraway ridge, one of the distant riders fell from his horse. The hunters stared. Some whispered, others simply froze, trying to understand what they had just seen. Billy Dixon had done the impossible. The warriors hesitated. Then they turned their horses and rode away, disappearing into the horizon. The battle was over, and that single shot fired by a calm, quiet man from nowhere became the beginning of a legend that would echo across the West for generations. Long before Billy Dixon became a name whispered in stories of the Wild West, before the impossible shot, before the battles and glory, there was only a small boy standing alone in a world that felt far too big for him. His life began quietly on September 25, 1850, in a rough cabin in Ohio County, West Virginia. The cabin sat near rolling hills, open woods, and muddy roads that stretched toward distant farms. The land was peaceful, but life for the Dixon family was not easy. They were poor, and every day was a battle to survive. Billy was one of several children, but even in a full house, he often felt alone. His father worked endlessly, cutting wood and doing farm labor. His mother tried to keep the family together, but sickness came often during those years, and medicine was rare. By the time Billy was old enough to walk, he learned what hardship felt like, and before he reached his teenage years, tragedy struck deeper than anything he could have imagined. One after another, illness took his parents from him. There was no warning, no chance to prepare, no gentle goodbye. One day he had a mother and father. The next, he had nothing at all. For Billy, childhood ended in a moment. He stood outside the small cabin, watching neighbors carry away the bodies for burial. The sky was gray that day, the air cold. There were no comforting arms around him, no promises that things would get better. There was only silence, and a boy left completely alone. He was placed under the care of different distant relatives for a short time, but none of them had enough food, money, or time to care for another mouth. The country was changing fast. The Civil War was beginning. Everyone struggled. There was no space for an orphan. So Billy learned early what many men do not learn until much later. If he wanted to live, he had to depend on himself. He stepped out into the world as a child who had no choice but to become a man. At the age of 12, Billy decided he would not stay where he was unwanted. He packed the little he owned, a small knife, a blanket, and a few clothes, and began walking westward. The road was long and cruel. He slept in barns when farmers allowed it, and under trees when they didn't. Sometimes strangers helped him with a warm meal. Other times, they chased him away. He worked for pennies, scraping by however he could. But even in all that struggle, he found something important, calling freedom. He didn't answer to anyone. He didn't depend on anyone. Every mile he walked made him stronger, tougher, and more willing to face whatever came next. He eventually reached Missouri, where he found work on farms and ranches. He learned how to handle horses. He learned how to fix wagons. He watched older men with rifles and slowly began teaching himself how to shoot. Life was still hard. He wore the same clothes until they nearly fell apart. He ate simple food, cold beans, hard biscuits, whatever he could find. But now he had a direction, a purpose. The West was calling by the time Billy reached Kansas. He was in his mid-teens and already looked older than his years. Hard work does that to a boy. It sharpens the eyes. It quiets the voice. It plants a kind of stillness into the heart. Kansas was different from the places he had known. It was wilder, rougher, filled with travelers, soldiers, traders, and families trying to start new lives. There were fights in saloons, dust storms rolling across the plains, and whispers of opportunity. Billy blended into this world easily. He was quiet, polite, and willing to work. People liked him, even if he rarely talked about himself. He didn't boast. He didn't pick fights. He didn't complain. He just did the job, whatever it was. This attitude helped him find steady work with freight companies. This is where he became a bullwhacker, driving long oxen teams across dangerous routes to deliver goods to frontier towns and military forts. The job was exhausting, dirty, dangerous. Rivers had to be crossed. Wagon wheels broke. Weather turned brutal. Sometimes they were attacked. Sometimes they got lost. Sometimes they went days without seeing another soul. But Billy grew stronger. He learned to judge distance across open plains. He learned to read trails like a map. He learned to listen to the wind and predict storms before they arrived. And each night, when the wagons circled for rest, Billy practiced shooting. He used old rifles when he could borrow them. He collected tin cans and bottles to use as targets. He studied how bullets dropped with distance and how wind pushed them sideways. He became patient, learning to wait for the exact right moment before pulling the trigger. The other men noticed. "Kid's got steady hands," they said, calm as a man twice his age. No one knew they were watching the early steps of a future legend. Billy's shooting talent didn't come from training classes or fancy equipment. It came from hunger, survival, and a deep personal need to master something in a world he couldn't control. When he aimed a rifle, the world made sense. Distance, wind, breath, silence, it was the one place where Billy felt completely steady, and this skill would soon open the door to a new life, one filled with danger, money, and violent conflict. Because in the early 1870s, a new job was sweeping across the plains: buffalo hunting. Thousands of massive animals roamed the land, and hunters were being paid good money to kill them for hides. It was hard work, it was risky, but it was a chance. Billy Dixon, an orphan boy who had walked across states to survive, was ready for that chance. He did not know that this choice would lead him straight into the center of one of the most dramatic chapters in American frontier history. He did not know it would shape him into a legend, but the West knew, and it was waiting. When Billy Dixon stepped into the early 1870s, he was no longer the thin, scared boy who had walked alone across states. He was a young man, now quiet, hardworking, and shaped by loss and survival. He had calm eyes, steady hands, and a mind that studied the world carefully. These qualities were about to push him into one of the most dangerous and important roles on the frontier. The Great Plains were changing fast. Trains were stretching across the land. Settlers wanted farms, towns, and railroads. Military forts were rising, and in the middle of all this stood the buffalo, millions of them. Roaming freely across the grasslands, buffalo were the heart of the Plains tribe's way of life. They used every part of the animal for food, clothing, tools, and shelter. But to the markets back east, buffalo meant money. Factories wanted hides. Traders wanted meat. Hunters wanted the thrill and the profit. And suddenly, a new line of work exploded across the West. Buffalo hunting. Hunters came from everywhere: Texas, Kansas, Colorado, the Dakotas. Some were skilled, many were not, but all of them wanted the same thing: quick money. When Billy heard about this new trade, he understood the risk immediately. Buffalo hunting wasn't just a job. It was a battle, sometimes against the weather, sometimes against the land, and sometimes against warriors who were desperate to protect what was left of their home. But Billy also knew one thing: this was his chance to finally build a life. And so, he stepped into a world filled with dust, danger, and the echoes of thundering hooves. Billy joined a hunting outfit in western Kansas. The company consisted of a wagon driver, a skinner, a cook, and a few riflemen. Their camp was simple canvas tents, a fire pit, stacks of hides drying in the sun, and tools scattered everywhere. But to Billy, it felt like freedom. It was rough and raw, but it was his. The first time he went out with a rifle to kill buffalo, he was struck by the size of the animals. They were massive, dark, shaggy, powerful creatures that moved like rolling thunder when the herd ran. Shooting them required precision and respect. One wrong move, and the herd would scatter. Billy watched the older hunters closely. He studied their methods: the slow belly crawl through the grass, the steady breathing, the calm patience to wait for the perfect moment. Then, when it was his turn, Billy lay down in the dirt, aimed carefully, and fired. One buffalo fell, then another, then a third. The hunters around him nodded quietly. No cheering, no praise. In their world, a man either had skill or he didn't. Billy had it. Soon, he was the one others watched for guidance. Buffalo hunting was not a glamorous job. It was cold in the winter, hot in the summer, and always dirty. Hunters woke before dawn, ate whatever food they could scrape together, and rode out into endless fields of grass with rifles over their shoulders. They stayed out for hours, sometimes days. When Billy returned to camp, the work continued. Hides needed to be stretched and dried. Meat needed to be cut, smoked, or sold. Tools had to be repaired. There was always something to do. Sometimes storms rolled across the plains without warning. Lightning struck close to camp. Wind tore down tents. Rain turned the ground into mud. At night, wolves prowled around the edges of camp, drawn by the smell of fresh meat. But Billy rarely complained. He had already lived through harder things. This life, dangerous as it was, felt strangely simple to him. It had rules. It had purpose. And it gave him money. Enough to slowly build a future he had never imagined having. But the buffalo hunting industry brought trouble. Every buffalo killed meant less food and fewer resources for the tribes who depended on them. As settlers moved deeper into the plains and hunters pushed farther south, tensions grew. Warriors often watched the hunters from a distance. Sometimes they approached the camp, demanding the hunters leave. Sometimes they attacked. Billy saw these conflicts up close. One night, he woke to the sound of distant war cries. Flames rose from a nearby hunting camp. Riders charged through the darkness, arrows firing into tents. By sunrise, the camp was gone, burned, destroyed. Billy knew then that the hunting grounds were turning into a war zone. But he didn't back down. He kept working, kept hunting, kept living by the rifle. He understood the risk. He also understood the reality. The world was changing, and he was caught in the middle of it. Billy's reputation slowly grew among hunters. Not because he talked about himself, he didn't. Not because he bragged, he never did. His name spread because men saw what he could do. He could hit a buffalo from distances most hunters didn't even attempt. He could stay calm under pressure when others panicked. He was reliable, steady, and brave without wanting to be. Hunters wanted him in their camps. Captains wanted him in their scouting parties. Soldiers trusted him on long rides. Billy Dixon wasn't famous yet, but he was becoming known, and the next step in his life would take him deeper into the heart of the frontier, where danger was everywhere and survival depended on skill, instinct, and luck. What Billy didn't know was that his life as a buffalo hunter was preparing him for something far bigger. That the long days on the plains taught him patience. The storms taught him endurance. The dangers taught him courage, and the endless practice with the rifle turned him into one of the greatest marksmen the West would ever see. All of these things were shaping him for one chapter, one event that would turn his name into a legend whispered for generations. The Battle of Adobe Walls. But before that day came, Billy would face even greater challenges. Conflicts that would test everything he had learned. His journey was only beginning. By the early summer of 1874, the Great Plains felt different. The wind still moved through the tall grass. The sun still burned hot over the land. And the wide sky still stretched endlessly, without interruption. But something had changed beneath the surface. Something tense. Something uneasy. Buffalo herds were growing smaller. Hunters were pushing deeper into tribal lands. And warriors from several plains tribes were growing more determined to defend what remained of their way of life. This was the world Billy Dixon rode into when he joined a new hunting expedition heading toward the Texas Panhandle. The men were excited. They had heard rumors of huge buffalo herds still roaming the area. The hides would bring good money. The land was open and wild, perfect for skilled riflemen. But many hunters sensed danger too. They spoke quietly at night around campfires, sharing stories of raids, burned wagons, and camps wiped out without warning. Some men felt something dark hanging over the plains, like a storm building far away but moving closer each day. Billy heard the stories, but he did not let fear guide him. His life had taught him not to run from difficult things. Instead, he watched, listened, and prepared. As he always did, the group Billy joined consisted of a wagon train loaded with ammunition, food, tools, and heavy Sharps rifles used for buffalo hunting. They traveled for days across rolling prairie, following narrow trails carved by other hunting parties. The men with him were experienced. They joked, argued, and told stories as they rode. Some were rough, some were friendly. All were hardened by life on the plains. Billy stayed mostly quiet. He watched the sky, the ground, and the distant horizon. He listened to the sounds of the animals at night. He studied tracks left in the dust, buffalo tracks, deer tracks, and sometimes horse tracks that didn't belong to settlers. He felt the tension, building slowly like a rope, pulling tighter with every mile they traveled. Finally, after many days, the hunters reached their destination, Adobe Walls. Adobe Walls was not a town, it was not a fort. It was more like a temporary base, made of thick adobe bricks, a crude collection of buildings built for one purpose: supporting buffalo hunters. There were just a few structures: a blacksmith shop, a general store, a saloon, a couple of bunkhouses. Nothing more. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in importance. Hunters from miles around used Adobe Walls as a place to rest, repair equipment, buy supplies, and share news. There was always noise, hammering metal, shouting men, clattering dishes, horses snorting, and rifles firing at distant targets for practice. When Billy arrived, the settlement was busy. Teams were preparing for the next day's hunt. Smoke rose from campfires. Men laughed loudly, betting money on shooting contests. Others cleaned their rifles under the shade of a wagon. But beneath all that activity, there was something else in the air. Many of the hunters had seen signs of warriors nearby: tracks, campfires, fresh trails. At night, some men swore they heard distant cries carried on the wind. Billy felt it too. A sense of eyes watching from somewhere out there, beyond the hills. Something waiting. Despite the tension, the camp settled into a daily routine. Billy spent most of his time preparing for the hunt, checking ammunition, organizing supplies, and studying the land. He often walked to the edge of camp at sunset, staring out over the wide plains, as if trying to understand what was coming. Other hunters noticed how calm he was. One man commented, "Nothing shakes that Dixon boy. He's like a rock in the middle of a river." Billy wasn't fearless. He simply learned not to show fear. Life had taught him that fear only wasted time and clouded judgment. If trouble was coming, he wanted to be ready. At night, the men talked about the tribes possibly gathering for a large attack. Some laughed it off. Others stayed awake late into the night, rifles close by. No one knew the truth then, but warriors from the Comanche, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes were gathering not far from Adobe Walls, and they were preparing for something big. June 26, 1874. The night was warm and quiet. Most of the hunters had gone to sleep inside the buildings. A few remained awake, drinking, sharpening knives, or cleaning guns. Billy found a spot to lie down in the saloon. His rifle was beside him. His hat covered part of his face. He expected the next day to be like any other: wake early, eat a quick meal, and head out on the hunt. But something unusual happened that night. A loud cracking sound echoed through the camp, a strange noise that woke several men. They complained that the building was making too much noise, that the timber beams were shifting or settling unevenly. No one thought much of it. These buildings were old. This was normal, or so they believed. But that noise was not wood settling. It was not the crack of old walls shifting. It was something much more dangerous, too. Hunters stepped outside to investigate. They looked into the darkness, saw nothing, and quietly returned indoors. Everything seemed calm. Everyone went back to sleep. But outside, in the deep shadows beyond the ridges, hundreds of mounted warriors were already gathering. They were preparing for an attack at dawn, an attack unlike anything the buffalo hunters had ever seen. As the night grew deeper, a stillness settled over Adobe Walls. No wind, no movement. Even the animals grew quiet. It was the kind of silence that made the skin crawl. Billy Dixon lay peacefully, unaware that the next sunrise would test every skill he had learned from childhood. To this moment, he did not yet know that the battle coming would mark him forever, and that he would soon make a shot that would echo through history. The storm was coming. The warriors were ready, and when dawn arrived, the world would shake. Dawn had not yet broken when the world around Adobe Walls suddenly shifted. It began with a strange, distant tremble, so soft that the sleeping hunters did not stir, so quiet it blended with the stillness of night. But the earth felt it. The ground vibrated, just slightly, as if something heavy was moving across it. Then came a sharp crack, wood striking wood. Inside the buildings, the men jolted awake. One hunter cursed, complaining again about the noise the old beams had made the night before. Another rubbed his eyes and muttered that someone must have slammed the door too hard. Billy Dixon opened his eyes slowly. He listened. His instincts whispered that something wasn't right. The air felt different, tight, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. A second loud thud shook the roof. That was enough. Billy pushed himself up from the floorboards and grabbed his rifle. Before he could move, a third impact hit the building, louder this time. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Men sat up, confused and irritated. "What in blazes is going on?" Someone shouted. Billy didn't answer. He was already walking toward the door. The moment he stepped outside, the world exploded into motion. A chilling sound cut through the morning, the sharp, terrifying cry of warriors charging at full speed. It was followed by the thunder of hooves, the whistle of arrows, and the echo of hundreds of voices shouting in unison. Billy's eyes widened as the truth slammed into him. They were under attack from every direction. Riders swept across the plains, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, moving like a storm of dust and fury. It was one of the largest coordinated attacks the region had ever seen. In an instant, Billy spun around and yelled, "To arms! Awake! They're here!" His voice sliced through the chaos inside the saloon. Men burst from their sleeping places, some still half-dressed, fumbling for rifles, bullets, and boots. Panic filled the room as warriors closed the distance. The hunters could already hear arrows striking the walls. Billy rushed back inside, long enough to grab his ammunition belt and reload. The noise grew louder, horses screaming, warriors shouting, bullets firing from other buildings where hunters had already taken positions. As Billy stepped outside again, he saw the unbelievable warriors were charging straight at the buildings, trying to break through the doors, climbing the roof, firing from horseback, pushing in waves. It was chaos. But chaos did not shake Billy Dixon. He darted toward a corner of the building, dropped to one knee, and took aim. His breathing slowed. His hands steadied. The world around him faded, leaving only the distant target and the task before him. He fired. A warrior fell. Then another. And another. Every bullet had purpose. Every shot was controlled. Men nearby shouted for support, but Billy didn't react. He simply reloaded and fired again, his calm contrasting sharply with the storm around him. The initial attack was the fiercest. Warriors rode dangerously close to the buildings, showing no fear. Some jumped off horseback to fight on foot. Arrows stuck into the adobe walls with sharp thuds, shaking the structure. Gunsmoke filled the air until it was hard to breathe. One hunter shouted, "They're trying to break the doors." Another cried out in pain, falling back after an arrow struck his arm. Billy heard everything, but stayed steady. From inside the buildings, men fired through windows and cracks in the walls. They shouted warnings, encouragement, and prayers. Some were trained shooters. Others had never seen a large-scale battle before, but all of them understood the same truth. If the warriors broke through the walls, the hunters wouldn't survive. Though outnumbered many times over, the hunters did not fall apart. They formed small groups, each defending a different building. They worked quickly, passing ammunition, fixing rifles, supporting those who were wounded. Billy moved between positions when he could, helping men aim, offering calm instructions, and making shot after shot with deadly precision. His voice was steady. "Hold your fire until they're close. Don't waste bullets. Watch the left side, they're circling around." Men listened to him. He had become, without anyone saying it aloud, one of their leaders. After nearly an hour of intense fighting, the first wave of warriors pulled back slightly, regrouping near the ridges. From a distance, they looked like dark shapes gathering in shadow. Inside adobe walls, the hunters tried to catch their breath. Some wiped blood from their faces. Others checked ammunition and replaced broken rifles. A few slumped against the walls, exhausted and pale. Billy remained focused. "This isn't over," he said quietly to the man beside him. He was right. War cries rose again from the hills. The warriors were preparing for another charge, one just as deadly as the first. But something unexpected happened. As the warriors regrouped, they stopped at a spot far away, so far that most hunters assumed they were completely out of rifle range. Most, but not Billy. One hunter pointed toward the ridge. "They're too far," he said. "Nothing we can do." But Billy didn't look away. He studied the ridge carefully. His instincts began to stir. The battle wasn't just about surviving. Now it was about breaking the enemy's will. And something inside him whispered that he could do it. The others didn't understand. They couldn't imagine it. But Billy Dixon could. A plan was forming in his mind, one that would change history. As the warriors gathered on the distant ridge, the hunters watched helplessly. They knew the next wave might be worse. They were tired. Supplies were already running low, and many were badly wounded. Billy slowly walked toward his rifle, his heavy, trusted Sharp's buffalo gun, the same weapon that would soon create a legend. But for now, the battle raged on. The warriors were preparing to strike again. The hunters were tightening their defenses. Fear mixed with courage in every building. The storm was far from over, and Billy Dixon was just getting started. The sun rose higher over the Texas Panhandle, turning the plains bright gold. Smoke drifted across the settlement, mixing with dust kicked up during the battle. Inside Adobe walls, the hunters were breathing hard, sweating and trying to steady their nerves. The first wave of the attack had been terrifying, violent, and almost overwhelming. But now, something strange was happening. The warriors who had charged the buildings with such speed and fury were pulling back farther and farther until they gathered on a distant ridge. They sat on their horses, watching the buildings from over a mile away. Their silhouettes formed a dark line against the bright horizon. The hunters inside Adobe walls stared at them in confusion. "They're too far," one man said. "They're regrouping," another replied. "What do they want?" Someone asked. Billy Dixon didn't answer. He simply watched the ridge. He studied their position, the height of the hill, and the steady movement of the wind. His mind was working quietly, piece by piece, the same way he studied a buffalo herd. Before taking a long-distance shot, he knew the warriors were preparing for something else. Maybe another attack. Maybe a slow, careful plan. Maybe intimidation, but Billy also understood something that many of the others did not. This was the moment to strike. The men inside the settlement were nervous. Many were wounded. Some had only a few bullets left. Others were shaken from exhaustion and fear. They did not know how much longer they could hold out if the warriors charged again. One hunter said what everyone else was thinking. "We need to do something. Something big." But what could they possibly do against riders who were more than 1,000 yards away? No normal hunter could reach that far. No regular rifle could make a shot like that. And even if they tried, it would waste ammunition they desperately needed. Another man turned to Billy and said, half joking, "Why don't you take a shot at them?" The room grew quiet. Everyone looked at him. Billy didn't smile. He didn't brag. He simply thought, "It's too far," he said softly. "Almost impossible." He told the truth. The shot was nearly impossible. The distance alone was extreme. The wind was unpredictable. The sun was rising at a strange angle. Any one of these factors could send the bullet flying off target by hundreds of yards. But the hunters kept watching him. Billy Dixon was not a man who claimed he could do the impossible, but he was the only man who might actually try. Billy walked into one of the buildings and retrieved his heavy Sharp's .502-90 rifle, the kind used for buffalo hunting at very long distances. The rifle was powerful, but slow to load. It demanded precision. It demanded patience. He carried it outside. The other hunters followed, watching in silence as Billy walked toward a small rise in the ground. He lay down on his stomach, pressing his chest into the earth for stability. He adjusted the rifle carefully, lining up the distant ridge through his iron sights. The men around him whispered, "Can he really do it? No one can make that shot. He's crazy to even try." Billy ignored all of it. He didn't listen to doubt. He didn't listen to fear. He listened only to the land. He slowed his breathing. He judged the wind's direction by watching the sway of grass. He estimated the drop of the bullet over such a great distance. He felt the weight of the rifle settle into his shoulder. Every movement was controlled. Every thought was quiet. Time seemed to slow down around him. Billy Dixon held his breath. His fingers squeezed the trigger. The rifle exploded with a deep, powerful roar that shook the air. A cloud of smoke burst from the barrel. The recoil slammed into Billy's shoulder so hard it would have knocked a weaker man. Off balance, then silence. The hunters held their breath. Billy never looked away from the ridge. He watched the tiny, distant shapes. He waited. A second passed. Then another. Then another. And then it happened. One of the riders on the distant ridge suddenly dropped from his horse. The men at Adobe walls gasped. Someone shouted. He hit him. By God, he actually hit him. The warriors on the ridge panicked. They had never seen anything like this. A shot fired from more than a mile away, a shot that shouldn't have been possible, had struck down one of their own. They stared toward Adobe walls in disbelief. Then they turned their horses, and they rode away. The battle was over. For a moment, even the hunters didn't fully understand what had happened. They stood quietly, staring at Billy Dixon and the distant ridge. A mile over rough terrain, against shifting wind, with simple iron sights. Under pressure, after a long, brutal attack, it defied reason. Billy slowly stood, dusted off his clothes, and reloaded his rifle. Someone ran over to him excitedly and said, "That was incredible. That was a miracle." Billy shook his head. "Just a lucky shot," he said calmly. But everyone knew it was not just luck. Not fully. It was skill. It was experience. It was calm under pressure. It was something rare, something only someone like Billy Dixon could make real. The hunters survived because of that shot. The warriors, shocked and unsure of what kind of rifles these men possessed, chose to retreat instead of launching another wave of attacks. Billy Dixon never bragged about it. He never claimed to be a hero. He simply did what he felt needed to be done. But the story spread first through the camps, then across Texas, then across the entire American frontier. Over time, people repeated different distances. 1,000 yards, 1,200 yards, even 1,538 yards. No one knew the exact number for certain, but the truth remained the same. Billy Dixon had fired a shot that changed a battle and made him a legend. After the incredible events at Adobe Walls, Billy Dixon became known across the frontier as a calm, fearless marksman. But fame in the West did not bring peace. The land was still full of danger, and the relationship between hunters, settlers, and the Plains tribes grew more violent every day. Billy knew this world well. He had lived in it. He had survived it. And yet, only a few months after Adobe Walls, he found himself facing another deadly situation, one even more desperate, more chaotic, and more terrifying. It would be remembered as the Buffalo Wallow fight. After Adobe Walls, the U.S. Army increased its efforts to control the region. They needed men who understood the landmen, who could track, shoot, and survive in places where maps meant nothing. They needed scouts, and Billy Dixon, with his calm mind and steady hands, was exactly the kind of man they searched for. Billy agreed to serve as a civilian scout. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't carry rank, but soldiers trusted him, and that trust meant everything out on the plains. His closest partner during this time was another scout named Amos Chapman, a brave and loyal man who respected Billy deeply. Together, they rode through harsh landscapes, delivering messages between forts, guiding troops, and watching for signs of danger. On September 12, 1874, the danger found them. Billy, Amos Chapman, and 4 soldiers were on a routine mission near the Texas Panhandle. Their job was simple: carry a dispatcher military message from one post to another. They had done this many times before. The air was warm. The sky was clear. The land looked peaceful. But the plains could be deceiving. As the group rode across open prairie, a sudden movement caught Billy's eye. A faint cloud of dust rising behind a distant ridge, shapes moving quickly. He slowed his horse. "Something's coming," he said quietly. The others scanned the horizon. Within seconds, they saw them, a large war party, riding hard and fast toward them. Warriors on horseback, armed with rifles, bows, and lances. It was an ambush ride, Billy shouted. The small group kicked their horses into full speed, racing toward a cluster of low hills. Bullets and arrows cut through the air. Horses screamed. The ground shook beneath pounding hoofs. The scouts and soldiers knew they could not outrun the warriors. They had to make a stand. Near the hills, Billy spotted a natural depression in the ground, a shallow hole, created long ago by buffalo rolling in the dirt. It wasn't deep, but it was the only cover for miles. "There," Billy yelled. The group turned sharply and dived into the depression. Dirt flew as they slid into the wallow, trying to make themselves as small as possible. The warriors circled around them immediately, firing from horseback. Dust and bullets sprayed everywhere. The scouts and soldiers hit the ground, pressing themselves tightly into the earth. The fight for survival had begun. The war party surrounded the wallow. Warriors rode in fast circles, firing as they passed. Others dismounted to shoot more accurately. The men inside the depression had nowhere to run. A bullet tore through Amos Chapman's leg. He cried out, falling backward. Blood soaked the dirt beneath him. Another soldier was hit in the shoulder. A third took an arrow to the hand. The remaining men were shaken, but Billy's voice cut through the panic. "Stay low. Keep firing when you see a target. His calmness gave the others strength. Even wounded, they fought with everything they had. The sound of gunfire echoed across the plains. Sharp, loud, relentless. Warriors charged closer. Dust swirled. Horses reared. The world outside the wallow was chaos. But Billy Dixon refused to give up. Hour after hour, the battle continued. The sun climbed higher, burning the men in the wallow. They were thirsty, exhausted, and in terrible pain. Flies gathered around blood. Dirt stuck to sweat-soaked faces. Ammunition was running low. But every time a warrior approached too closely, Billy took a shot. He moved slowly, carefully, conserving bullets, waiting for the exact moment to fire. His accuracy, steady, even in the middle of terror, kept the warriors from rushing the wallow. Amos Chapman, despite his wounded leg, kept fighting too. He held his rifle with trembling hands, gritting his teeth against the pain. The soldiers respected both men deeply that day. Even surrounded, even wounded, even hopeless, they did not quit. As the long day dragged on, the warriors began to lose momentum. They had expected an easy kill, not a fierce stand from 6 determined men. The constant gunfire from the wallow slowed their attacks. Finally, near sunset, the war party decided the fight was no longer worth the cost. One by one, they began to withdraw, riding away toward the horizon. The sudden quiet felt unreal. Billy lifted his head slowly, scanning the area. The warriors were gone. They had survived. Later that evening, a small group of soldiers from a nearby fort discovered the battered men inside the wallow. They were shocked at what they found, bleeding, bruised, exhausted, but alive. 6 men, against dozens, in open ground, with almost no cover. It seemed impossible. Billy Dixon and Amos Chapman were credited for their courage and leadership, for their incredible bravery. They were awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition for heroism. Billy never bragged about it. He simply said, "We did what we had to do." But history remembered it differently. The Buffalo Wallow fight became one of the most remarkable survival stories of the American frontier. Another chapter in the growing legend of Billy Dixon. After months of fighting, scouting, and surviving some of the most dangerous missions on the frontier, Billy Dixon finally saw the world around him begin to change. The year was moving toward its end. The Red River War was losing strength. The tribes were retreating. Army patrols grew more confident, and the endless gunfire that once echoed across the plains slowly faded into silence. Billy had been a part of that long, painful, conflicted Adobe walls. The Buffalo Wallow fight, scouting missions, dangerous rides through open country. But now, at last, the distant rumble of war was growing quiet. For Billy Dixon, this silence felt strange. For the first time in years, he wasn't waking up to fear. He wasn't watching the horizon for ambushes. He wasn't loading rifles at dawn or delivering messages under fire. The war was ending, and Billy had to decide what came next. Billy Dixon had never sought fame, and he never wanted glory. He was simply a man trying to survive. But the frontier had a way of turning simple men into legends. Stories of his impossible shot at Adobe walls spread everywhere. Soldiers talked about him. Hunters admired him. Civilians spoke his name with respect and curiosity. He had become something he never asked to be, a frontier hero. But Billy didn't feel like a hero. Sometimes, late at night, he thought about the men he had seen fall. The sounds of battles still echoed in his mind. The thunder of hooves, the shouts, the fear, it all stayed with him. He needed peace, so he left the scouting life behind and began searching for something quieter, something steady, something that felt like home. With the fighting slowing, opportunities opened for men who understood the land. Ranches needed workers, towns needed builders, and new settlements needed people with experience and courage. Billy drifted through several small towns before settling in the Texas Panhandle again, not far from the places where he had fought. It was rough land, but it felt familiar. He knew its weather, its dangers, its beauty. He knew how to survive here. He became a ranch hand for a time, helping build fences, herd cattle, break horses, and manage large stretches of open range. His calmness made him valuable. Ranchers trusted him. New settlers sought his advice. Soldiers waved when they saw him. He had no desire to return to the battlefield. He wanted a quieter life. But something, or rather, someone was about to change everything. In the early 1880s, Billy met a young school teacher named Olive King. She was gentle, educated, and kind. Everything about her was different from the violent world Billy had known. When she looked at him, she didn't see the marksman from Adobe walls. She didn't see the scout or the hero. She simply saw a man quiet, thoughtful, and strong. Billy admired her calm voice, her sense of order, and the way she treated people with patience and respect. She admired his honesty and the steady way he faced life. Despite all the hardships he had survived, their friendship grew slowly, like grass after a long drought. And then, one day, Billy realized something he had never felt before. He wanted a future. Not just a fight, not just survival, a future. In 1883, Billy Dixon and Olive King were married. The ceremony was small and simple, but to Billy it felt monumental. It was the first time in his life he truly belonged somewhere. Olive brought peace into his world, and Billy brought strength into hers. Together, they began shaping a life that neither had ever dared to imagine. With Olive by his side, Billy settled in Hutchinson County, Texas. It was still rough country, endless land, few neighbors, unpredictable weather, but Billy saw potential. He began working as a rancher and a local guide. He used his knowledge of the land to help settlers, surveyors, and travelers. His reputation made people trust him. Before long, he was elected to local positions: deputy sheriff, county official, and even a community leader during emergencies. Billy Dixon, the orphan boy who had once wandered the plains alone, was now a respected citizen helping build a new society. Olive taught school, wrote letters, organized church meetings, and brought a sense of stability to the growing settlement. Together, she and Billy shaped the area into a place families could call home. Neighbors often said, "Billy Dixon is a man you can depend on," and that meant more to him than any medal or myth. Even as he built a peaceful life, Billy could not completely escape his memories. Sometimes at night, he walked outside alone, gazing over the plains. The wind carried sounds that weren't really their hoofbeats. Distant gunfire, the cries of warriors charging. The land was quiet now, but the past lived inside him. Olive understood. She listened when he needed to talk. She comforted him when he grew silent. She reminded him that he had earned his peace. Slowly, Billy learned to let go of the darker memories. He found satisfaction in simple things: the warmth of a fire, the laughter of neighbors, the feel of a horse under him, the sight of endless sky without the fear of war. It was a slow healing, but it was real. Billy Dixon could have chased fame. He could have sold his story, traveled city to city, and bragged about his legendary shot. People wanted to hear him speak. They wanted the excitement. They wanted the myth. But Billy was not a man who needed headlines. He didn't measure his worth in stories told about him. He measured it in hard work, in loyalty, in the quiet moments of a life he built with his own hands. He traded guns for tools, danger for stability, and war for family. He had survived the chaos of the frontier. Now, he was learning how to live in peace. By the late 1890s, the American frontier, the wild, unpredictable land that shaped Billy Dixon, was disappearing. The buffalo were gone. The tribes had been forced onto reservations. Railroads stretched across the plains. Towns appeared where there had once been silence and open sky. The era of gunsmoke, long hunts, and dusty trails was ending. And Billy Dixon, who had lived through every harsh season of the frontier, was entering the last chapter of his own long journey. Billy was no longer the young hunter who raced across the plains with a rifle on his back. He had gray in his hair now, deeper lines on his face, and a slower step. His hands, once steady enough to make impossible shots, had grown stiff with age and old injuries. But even as his body aged, his spirit stayed strong. People in the Texas Panhandle still came to him for advice, stories, or guidance. They trusted him. They respected him. Many saw him as the last living symbol of the Old West. Still, time moved on. The world around him changed. The rookies who once asked him how to shoot now carried new rifles and new tools. Children playing in the dirt around Hutchinson County had no idea how dangerous the land had once been. Billy Dixon had lived through a time most people only read about in books or heard in whispered stories. He had fought battles, survived ambushes, ridden across burning plains, and stared death in the face more times than he could count. But now, the fights were over. The danger was gone, and Billy found himself learning to live with something new: quiet, Billy and his wife, Olive, built a simple but happy life together. Their home was warm and peaceful, filled with books, letters, and years of shared memories. Olive wrote often about their life, about Billy's experiences, about the land they lived on. Billy preferred to keep busy. He ran cattle, managed land, and helped the community. His days were filled with chores, small responsibilities, and the soft comfort of routine. He no longer hunted buffalo. He no longer scouted for the army. And he no longer watched the horizon for signs of danger. Instead, he watched sunsets with Olive. He listened to the wind. He lived a life most frontier. Men never had the chance to reach. But as the years passed, the memories came back stronger. Sometimes, Billy awoke at night to echoes only he could hear: hoofbeats on the dirt, gunfire in the distance, war cries carried by the wind. He would sit quietly at the edge of the bed, staring out a window into the darkness. Olive understood. She never asked him to explain. She simply sat beside him and placed a gentle hand on his arm. Billy was grateful for her presence. She was the steady anchor he had never known as a child. With her, he felt grounded, safe, in a way he never felt on the battlefield. Still, the past stayed with him. The frontier leaves its marks, even on the strongest hearts. In time, people wanted Billy to tell his life story. Young men, writers, and historians visited him to hear about Adobe walls, the impossible shot, and the Buffalo Wallow fight. They listened with wide eyes, amazed that someone could live through so many dangerous moments. Billy spoke plainly, without exaggeration. He always said the same thing: "I did what had to be done." He never bragged. He never pretended to be more than he was. And he always insisted the famous long shot at Adobe walls was pure luck. Olive encouraged him to write his memories before time took them away. She helped gather stories, organize notes, and guide him when he struggled. Her patience and understanding turned Billy's memories into a book, one that kept his legacy alive long after he was gone. Together, they preserved a chapter of history that might have otherwise been forgotten. By the early 1900s, Billy's health began to fail. His strength faded. His old injuries ached more. His breath grew short on cold mornings. The hard life he once lived caught up with him slowly, like a shadow creeping across the ground. A doctor advised him to move somewhere with milder weather. So Billy and Olive left Texas and settled in Oklahoma, hoping the change would help. The move was emotional. Billy had spent most of his life in Texas, the land where he fought battles, hunted buffalo, made lifelong friends, and met Olive. Leaving it felt like leaving a part of himself behind, but he trusted Olive's judgment, and together they started again in a quiet Oklahoma town. Billy Dixon spent his final years in peace. He read books. He sat on porches. He told stories to children who could not imagine a world filled with buffalo and battles. He watched storms roll across the plains and listened to the soft rustling of grass. He lived a life few men survived long enough to enjoy. On March 9, 1913, Billy Dixon passed away quietly in his sleep. There was no battle, no gunfire, no thunder of horses, only quiet, calm rest. He was 62 years old. Olive mourned him deeply, as did the townspeople who had grown to love and respect him. They buried him in Oklahoma. But his story did not end there. Years later, in 1929, his body was moved back to the Texas Panhandle, back to Adobe walls, the place where his legend had begun. A stone monument was placed there, standing tall against the wind, honoring the man who had once changed the course of a battle with a single, incredible shot. Billy Dixon's life may have ended, but his legacy continues across history. His courage, calmness, and incredible skill with a rifle turned him into one of the great figures of the American West. He was not a man who sought attention, was not a man who boasted. He was simply a man who faced danger with quiet strength and survived. The world he lived in is gone now, but his story remains, carried across the plains by the same wind he once listened to in silence. As the years passed after Billy Dixon's death, the world changed even more. Cars replaced wagons. Towns rose where buffalo once roamed. Telephones and electricity reached the plains. The frontier, wild, open, and dangerous, became only a memory in the minds of old men and the pages of history books. But Billy Dixon's story did not fade. It grew, not because he sought glory, not because he told wild tales, but because people remembered the way he lived with courage, humility, and quiet strength. This final chapter asks a simple question: what makes a man like Billy Dixon a legend? To find the answer, we return to the beginning, the battles, the choices, and the heart of the man himself. Billy's life did not begin with greatness. It began with loss. He was not born into wealth, comfort, or protection. He had no guiding hand, no easy road. Life carved him through struggle-hard winters, endless work, hunger, and fear. And yet, he did not break. He learned to walk alone. He learned to survive without help. He learned to stay steady when the world around him shook. This is where legends are born, not in glory, but in hardship. Billy didn't become strong because he wanted to be a hero. He became strong because the world gave him no other choice. The Great Plains were not gentle. They demanded everything from those who lived on them. The prairie could freeze a man in winter, burn him in summer, starve him in drought, and swallow him whole in storms. But Billy learned its moods. He studied the sky like a map. He listened to the wind like a teacher. He learned to read tracks, judge distance, and understand danger long before it arrived. His skills were not magic. They were the result of thousands of days and nights spent working, watching, and learning. The frontier shaped him into someone capable of surviving anything. And survival, in Billy's world, was its own kind of heroism. Most men who become legends are loud. They brag, they tell stories, they show off. Billy Dixon did none of that. He spoke softly. He acted carefully. He stayed calm even when others panicked. He never shouted about his own courage. He never demanded respect. He never tried to make himself famous. And yet, people trusted him. Soldiers followed him. Hunters listened to him. Communities depended on him. He was a rock in the middle of a storm. Strong, solid, unmoving. His quiet nature made him different from the typical frontier hero. And in that difference, he became unforgettable. The impossible shot at Adobe walls became the moment people talked about most. A shot fired at a distance, so great that experts even today debate how he managed it. But the truth is simple. Billy didn't make that shot to become a hero. He made it to save the men beside him. He didn't think about fame. He didn't think about himself. He thought about survival, their survival. And when the bullet found its distant target, the world changed. The warriors pulled back. The siege ended. The hunters lived. Billy walked away from that moment quietly, calling it a lucky shot. Others called it legendary. If Adobe walls made Billy famous, the Buffalo Wallow fight proved his courage beyond any doubt. Surrounded, outnumbered, wounded, with no safe escape, Billy stood firm beside his fellow men. He didn't freeze. He didn't surrender. He didn't lose hope. He fought with the same calm he always carried, shot after shot, hour after hour, until the warriors finally retreated. 6 men went into that fight. 6 men walked out alive. History remembered their bravery. And once again, Billy Dixon refused to claim any special praise. He simply said they had done what they needed to do. That humility, that simple, honest humility, is one of the reasons his story endures. Many men who lived the violent life of the frontier died young by bullets, by accidents, by disease. Few lived long enough to grow old, settle down, and build a peaceful home. But Billy did. He became a rancher, a community leader, a husband, a man who helped others rather than fought them. He found peace where many only found graves. This second life quiet, steady, and meaningful is just as important as his years of conflict. It shows who Billy Dixon truly was beneath the legend. Not just a fighter, but a builder. Not just a marksman, but a man with heart. Today, Billy Dixon's name stands alongside the great figures of the American frontiermen, remembered not just for what they did, but for who they were. He taught us that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes, courage speaks softly. Sometimes, it walks with a steady step. Sometimes, it quietly protects the people around it. Billy Dixon's life tells us that greatness often comes from the simplest things. Doing the right thing, even when it is hard, standing firm in the face of fear, helping others survive. Choosing peace after a life of war, living with dignity. Honesty and humility, these qualities last longer than any gunfight. If you stand at Adobe walls today, you can still feel the wind sweeping across the plains. You can hear the distant cry of hawks, the whisper of grass bending under the sky, in the deep silence of a land that once witnessed incredible courage. A stone monument marks the place where Billy Dixon rests, a simple marker for a complicated man, And if you listen closely, it almost feels like his story rides on the wind, carried across the land he once knew so well, not forgotten, not faded, alive in every tale of the American frontier. Billy Dixon, a quiet man who became a legend not by chasing glory, but by surviving, by protecting, by enduring, and by living a life that still inspires us today.